It's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the critical theory program this afternoon. Martin Hegel used to be involved in the program, and I'm no longer, but I felt compelled to come back, not only because Peter always compels me to come back to hear him, but also because Rob Kaufman, who would have introduced this book, is under the weather, and he's recovering from somewhat serious situation, doing well. Dan Blanton, who also was being involved, is out of town. He and Rob, along with Adorno, responsible for preparing this occasion why Peter is doing well. We can keep them together and going. Now, this is, of course, not the first time that I've introduced Peter. Peter and I, in fact, have been involved in a kind of strange reciprocal introduction game for the past God knows how many years. I did my degree at the institution that he teaches. He did his degree here. And so whenever we go back and forth, we do this kind of welcome home thing where we strive to be as forward and exuberant in order to embarrass the person who's going to do the job. Now, in fact, Peter is winning the contest because he never say winning in the sense that he now is the most embarrassed between us, because he gives me constantly more ammunition. It would take me as long as his talk now to recite his extraordinary accomplishments. When he left us about 25 or so years ago, he almost immediately got a junior fellowship at Princeton, and then was picked up by Harvard, where he stayed ever since. His first book, which came out of his dissertation at Berkeley, was an analysis of the relationship between Rosenzweig and Martin Heidegger, a book which won the 3 prizes, and is still a standard work in the discussion of German-Jewish relations in the Roman era. The second book went back to Heidegger, this time paired with the Sierra, the book called Continental Divide, which focused on the Davos dispute in 1929, one of the seminal anecdotal moments, really, more than that for the 20th century thought. He then interestingly swerved in a different direction, which brought him closer to the work that I've been doing years earlier on the Frankfurt School. It's quite fascinating. He is not a kind of direct descendant in the sense of the critical theory that I've been involved with over the years, which came to late in life, I would come to heavy moment, pretty remarkable books, and done lots of other extraordinary work. Explaining the Frankfurt School, not only to American or Anglo audience, but to German and other foreign audiences as well. His first book was Adorno and Experience, which dealt with Adorno's relationship to existential phenomenology. We then turned to the issue of secularization in the book called Migrants in Profane, which showed the entire Frankfurt School struggle with religious issues. And then most recently has published A Precarious Happiness, a book which deals with Adorno and Sources of Normativity. Several chapters of which would be the subject of our discussion. Those who will read those chapters tomorrow in the room right next door. And I gather it's still possible, although lunches are going to be assigned, if you, the last one you want to read the reading, so to get access to how you've done that. And we could then do the discussion. Now, Peter is also, I mean, I just listed the books. Peter is an enormously energetic, collaborative scholar. And if you look at his the number of conferences, the number of editions of books that he's edited, it's really remarkable. The kind of energy that brings together people, that allows a group of people to talk to one another. And in this sense, I would argue that Peter, in some ways, is the opposite of Adorno. Adorno, as a philosopher, was basically gnomic and interested in presenting ideas in a kind of condensed way. The aphorisms, for example, in minimum reality are basically the product of a mind that had certain noetical intuitions, you might say, and then condensed them into ideas and didn't defend, discuss, elaborate. He simply threw them out. Peter, on the other hand, has an extraordinarily discursive mentality. That's to say, he's constantly telling you what he's about to say, what he has said, what he will say, and what he hasn't. In other words, there's a sense of preparation, and also a sense of, you might say, respect for other arguments. That he will give you counter arguments and rebut them if you can. Adorno never did it. Adorno was basically just presenting ideas in a straightforward and authoritarian way. And Peter's style is very different. This book in particular is a book that those who don't know Adorno will really be able to see how the argument is built rather than just simply be hit by the counter. Finally, just the quick silly word yesterday, lunch you mentioned that one of the reviews of this book said that he had become an institution. And we both laughed at this, as many of you may know, just before Adorno was actually dead of a heart attack. He was assaulted by students who came up to the stage, read their breasts, and humiliated them. And the outcry was Adorno as an institution is dead. Now, Peter very clearly may be an institution, but it is extraordinarily alive. Great pleasure. Great pleasure to welcome you back to Berkeley. And having got us in the element, Stephen talk. I feel like this is dialectic. Hegel and
Thank you, Marty, for that very generous introduction, which went on, 25 minutes. So next time you're at Harvard, I've got a lot of work to do. Someone pointed out to me that it's Pi Day, so I should just begin by saying Happy Pi Day to everybody. Let's see. I want to explain that this talk builds off of some core insights in my most recent book that Marty just mentioned, although the direction I go is not a direction that I pursue in depth. I don't speak a great deal about Hegel directly in the book, so I thought I'd develop on whether this turns into something serious in a book or a paper. I'm not quite sure, so we'll see. Those who are concerned with the development of Marxist theory may recall the famous lines that appeared as an afterword to the second German edition of Marx's Capital, published in 1873. Responding to a dyspeptic review of his work in a St. Petersburg journal, the European Messenger, Marx defended himself against the charge that he relied on the dialectical method that critics now deemed obsolete. In its mystified form, the dialectic became the fashion in Germany because it seemed to transfigure and to glorify the existing state of things. In its rational form, it is a scandal, an abomination to the bourgeoisie and its doctrinaire professors, because it includes in its comprehension an affirmative recognition of the existing state of things, at the same time also the recognition of the negation of that state, of its inevitable breaking up, because it regards every historically developed social form as in fluid movement, and therefore takes into account its transient nature, not less than its momentary existence, because it lets nothing impose upon it, and is in its essence critical and revolutionary. Now, although I don't wish in this paper to dwell on the well-known problem of how Marx deployed the Hegelian dialectic, the lines I've just quoted from the second edition of Capital should suffice to lay to rest the hyperbolic claim that Marx's mature critique of political economy has no relation to the humanist or Hegelian themes of the young Marx, or that the two were divided by what Louis Althusser once called a coupure epistémologique. The passage confirms that well into his later years, Marx discerned at least two moments in the dialectic and meant to redeem what he called its rational kernel from its mystified shell. On one interpretation, the dialectic, as he says, is system affirmative and lends our given historical reality an illusory permanence. On a second interpretation, the dialectic volatilizes all of historical reality and reveals an imminent negativity that is destined to bring that system to an end. I've alluded to Marx's afterword here, not least because it illustrates the hermeneutic problem that all philosophical inheritance involves interpretation rather than mere retrieval. As Hans Blumenberg once observed, in the history of philosophy, there are no renaissances. Marx's defense of the dialectic serves as an instructive example of that general lesson. Marx knew that even while sustaining his allegiance to the critical moment of the dialectic, he also needed to break free of its affirmative moment. His inheritance of the dialectic, you might say, was itself dialectical. It sustained continuity only through criticism. Now, I also want to recall this problem of dialectical inheritance because it bears closely on the topic of my discussion today. In what follows, I want to explore the question of how Adorno and Hegel differ in their conception of a dialectic and what the difference between them actually consists in. This is a well-known problem that many scholars before me have grappled with, though it should hardly surprise us that they have reached little consensus. We can make an initial leap into the debate if we consider what has by now become the more or less conventional view. Borrowing from Marx's 1873 afterword to Capital, we might say that the Hegelian dialectic allows for at least two readings, affirmative and negative. The conventional view is that Adorno rejected the first but embraced the second, which is to say, if Hegel conceived of the dialectic as an instrument for affirming the rationality of what already exists, Adorno emphasized the transience of what exists and used the dialectic in a critical mode to reveal present irrationalities. To put the matter simply, Adorno took up negation without reconciliation, and he denied the Hegelian drive to sublate the negative into a rationally mediated whole. In contesting Hegel's idea that speculative reason can grasp the identity of identity and non-identity, Adorno wished to sustain the non-identical as that which lies beyond the mind's conceptual reach. For Adorno, this turn toward the non-identical ensures that we acknowledge the enduring resistance of the material world against the subject and its bid for domination. Non-identity then signifies the irreducibility or what he called the primacy of the object. Nothing in this interpretation, however, would imply that Adorno abandoned the dialectic altogether. On the contrary, by emphasizing the non-identical, he merely upheld the persistence of negativity. And this permitted him to conceive of the dialectic not as an instrument of reconciliation, but as a critical method that never comes to rest within a rationally mediated whole. By scrutinizing all gestures of completion, the dialectic became for Adorno not an instrument of affirmation, but of endless critique. We can summarize their disagreement by recalling a well-known dictum in Hegel's phenomenology that the true is the whole. To this, Adorno offered the famous rejoinder, the whole is the untrue. Now, if we're forced to summarize the standard reading, a few simple phrases, we might employ Marx's language from the second afterword to Capital. Adorno rejected what he took to be the affirmative dialectic, and he turned it in a direction of unrelieved negativity. Scholars such as Fabian Feijenhagen have taken this distinction in earnest. Adorno's dialectic, he argues, is one of thoroughgoing negativism. It does not endorse any standards of the good, but only warns us off from the bad. The most Adorno can do is the rather dispiriting ethic that Feijenhagen calls living less wrongly. I should note that the negativist reading expresses a commonplace verdict among historians of Western Marxism. Perry Anderson, for example, once called Western Marxism a product of defeat because it broke the dialectical bond between theory and practice. The painful rupture between Adorno and student militants in the spring of 1969 has further enhanced the impression that Adorno was merely an haute bourgeois intellectual whose actual politics were anything but revolutionary. And it's encouraged those who would follow Georg Lukács in dismissing Adorno along with the whole of the Frankfurt School as an elitist tribe who turned away from political realities and took up a permanent home in the Grand Hotel Abyss. Now, even if this caricature were accurate, we would still want to ask whether it's always better to bind theory to practice for the sake of political efficacy. The tragic example of Lukács himself may suffice to remind us that this conclusion hardly follows. Although Adorno admired Lukács for helping to revive the dialectical spirit in Marxism, Adorno's admiration was shattered when the Hungarian philosopher debased himself before the Eastern Bloc authorities and rescinded his own Hegelian interpretation as heterodoxy. In a 1958 essay that bears the charged title Extorted Reconciliation, Adorno condemns Lukács for bending to a vulgarized Hegelianism. An extorted reconciliation, after all, signifies not a rational mediation of universal and particular, but merely the domination of the particular theorist by a state that falsely proclaims its universality. No philosopher who claims to uphold a norm of emancipation can bend his knee to authoritarianism without betraying the philosophy he means to honor. This episode should remind us, I think, that whatever Adorno had learned from Lukács, he had also learned not to follow his political example. But the quarrel with Lukács may leave even Adorno's more charitable readers dissatisfied. The difficulty is that it lends further credence to Anderson's charge that Western Marxism reflects a breakdown between theory and practice. Adorno himself only enhanced this impression in the opening lines of his 1966 Negative Dialectic, where he wrote that philosophy lives on only because the moment of its realization was missed. Now, from these lines, we might conclude that Adorno was a defeatist precisely because he took the Hegelian dialectic in earnest. If self-expressive spirit should have created a world hospitable to the idea of freedom, the failure of its aims left Adorno vulnerable to a mood of political quietism that Benjamin once diagnosed as left-wing melancholy. It should hardly surprise us that skeptical readers, such as Michael Rosen, have been ready to conclude that Adorno gave up on political agency altogether. In his 1982 study, Hegel's Dialectic and Its Criticism, Rosen writes that theory alone, untethered from practice, becomes for Adorno the last preserve of a powerless resistance. And here's the quote: "Operating in language, theory retains a power of transcendence, available to the most unpolitical thinker who chooses to resist the instrumentalization of intellectual life. The intellectuals, diminished in stature though they are by their own marginality, are the 20th century's only culture heroes." And that's from Michael Rosen's extraordinary book, Hegel's Dialectic and Its Criticism, from 1982. The question of whether theory enjoys this kind of quietistic prestige is best left for another occasion. For the purposes of my paper, I don't wish to dwell on the complex matter of Adorno's actual politics. Today, I want to fashion my attention instead on the strictly philosophical question as to how Adorno and Hegel conceive of the dialectic, and I'll suggest that the standard interpretation is misleading on strictly philosophical grounds. My argument has two parts. First, I want to specify in what ways Adorno and Hegel part company in their conceptions of the dialectic. Now, the first task may seem to justify Marx's distinction between a dialectic that involves affirmation as against a dialectic that involves critique. In the second portion of my lecture, however, I want to challenge that impression. I'll set forth the rather more surprising claim that Adorno endorses a certain ideal of reconciliation that places him in far greater proximity to Hegel than we might have imagined. Now, my first task already demands too much. Anyone who means to lay out an intelligible summary of the Hegelian dialectic is open to the charge that a summary is only possible once one has traveled the long path of philosophical history from its beginning. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel warns that impatience demands the impossible, namely the attainment of the end without the means. And he continues as follows: "But the length of this path has to be endured, because for one thing, each moment is necessary. And further, each moment has to be lingered over, because each is itself a complete individual shape, and one is only viewed in absolute perspective when its determinateness is regarded as a concrete whole. or the whole is regarded as uniquely qualified by that determination. Since the substance of the individual, the world spirit itself, has had the patience to pass through these shapes over the long passage of time and to take upon itself the enormous labor of world history in which it embodied in each shape as much of its entire content as that shape was capable of holding, and since it could not have attained consciousness of itself by any lesser effort, the individual certainly cannot, by the nature of the case, comprehend his own substance more easily. Now, from that passage, we can draw the lesson that for Hegel, the dialectic is the name for the structure of reason itself. Spirit just is reason, as it undergoes a process of educative growth, and at each stage it is confronted with the insufficiency of its claims. By placing skeptical pressure on these claims, we can observe how spirit surpasses its current manifestation and gains a more adequate understanding of its own purposes. Consider, for instance, the model of empiricism. We might believe that knowledge consists in nothing more than the claims of self-certainty. To know something would be to confront the sensual phenomenon just as it appears. But such brute familiarity permits me to say only this and here. Any attempt to justify that familiarity as knowledge would require that I pass beyond the sensual phenomenon and situate it within a discursive context, where this and here is at least defined against that and there. But once we've admitted that requirement, we've already shown that empirical familiarity is mediated by conceptuality. So it turns out that by examining the claims of sense certainty, we are forced to accept that those claims are insufficient. Sensuality is mediated by discursivity. It's not by accident that this simple experiment serves as the opening chapter of Hegel's phenomenology, since it is a perfect pedagogical device that teaches us the first and most important lesson of his work: immediacy must yield to mediation. This method of learning was not Hegel's invention. We can find an intimation of the idea already in Plato's Sophist, where education is described as a dialectics, or conversation. A man's words are examined to expose their contradictions, and the interlocutor is then delivered from great prejudice. Hegel formalizes this method, that spirit must traverse contradiction or negativity on its path to greater knowledge. And here's the very famous passage. The life of spirit is not the life that shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched from devastation, but rather the life that endures it and maintains itself in it. It wins its truth only when, in utter dismemberment, it finds itself. It is this power, not as something positive which closes its eyes to the negative. On the contrary, spirit is this power only by looking the negative in the face and tarrying with it. This tarrying with the negative is the magical power that converts it into being. Now, within the confines of this lecture, I can hardly offer an exhaustive account of Hegel's dialectic, but I want to confine myself then to 2 points. The first point is that Hegel conceives of the dialectic as a rational process of development that remains imminent to what exists. The norm by which negativity is, in Hegel's phrase, converted into being, is not a norm that transcends our reality. It is a norm that is already imminent to reality. And the task of philosophical criticism is to employ this imminent criterion to show that any partial shape of consciousness is defeated with its own weapons. Or as Hegel said in the Logic, the true refutation must enter into the power of the opponent and place itself in the compass of his strength. This is, of course, what we call imminent critique, even if Hegel himself never used that phrase. The task of knowledge does not impose an exotic or external norm on what exists. Rather, it mobilizes the norms that are imminent to existence and shows us how any partial moment of existence must point toward a final condition where all partial moments find their rational interconnection within the systemic whole. So, for example, when Hegel speaks of right, he means to invoke a norm that already inheres in our social arrangements. A proper analysis of our social order will employ that norm for the purposes of philosophical knowledge. In the logic, he asserts this then as a general principle. The dialectic is, he writes, the imminent process of going beyond such determinacy, wherein the one-sided and limited character of the determinations of the understanding presents itself as what it is, namely as their negation. Everything finite is this, the sublating of itself. Thus, the dialectical moment constitutes the moving soul of the scientific progression and is the principle through which alone an imminent connection and necessity enters into the convent of science. Hegel believes that this principle of imminent critique is a feature of all our institutions, our practices, and our history, as he explains in a note to the logic. Properly construing and recognizing the dialectical dimension is of the highest importance. It is, in general, the principle of all movement, all life, and all actual activity. Okay, now that brings me to the second and more controversial point. Hegel believes that the task of philosophy should be to recognize the intrinsic rationality of existence as we find it, rather than constructing norms that lie beyond our current arrangements. I'll call this the principle of rational holism. The well-known image of the owl of Minerva who flies only at dusk is meant to convey the thought that philosophers cannot leap out of their own time, but must instead devote themselves to demonstrating how reason already obtains in the world as it is. But this means that rationality is not something that is yet to be achieved. If we direct our attention to negativity, this does not mean that we will see its disconnection. Rather, we will find that this negativity already finds its place within an extant rational whole. This is what it means for spirit to find itself. Logically, Hegel must embrace the notion of a rational whole because proper understanding of the negative and its contribution is only possible from the standpoint of spirit's fulfillment. In the Phenomenology, Hegel refers to this as the standpoint of completion or Fallible. To say that this completion or will to closure is necessary is just to say that it is a presupposition for recognizing how any particular moment of negativity fits into the all-embracing rational structure that Hegel calls absolute knowing. Robert Brandom, one of the more original readers of Hegel's work, claims that this kind of knowing amounts to what he calls recollective rationality. Where Brandom goes wrong, I think, lies in his attempt to transform Hegel's philosophy into a pragmatist theory about the norms we take to be authoritative. Brandom wants to say that if we take certain norms to be authoritative, we do so only because their authority lies in our recognition of them as such. This is why Brandom reads the Phenomenology as an inquiry into practices of trust. But Hegel himself, I believe, would reject this deflationary reading. He would insist that if certain norms are authoritative, this is not simply because we take them to be so, a pragmatist claim that leaves open the possibility that there might be other practices of recognition that would validate other norms. Rather, Hegel seems to have believed that rationality can be recollective if and only if we have arrived at the final station of knowledge, toward which all paths converge, like foothills that lead to the tallest peak. The deflationary reading, to quote Habermas, leaves us with a decapitated dialectic, since it robs Hegel of his confidence that spirit has reached its singular and rational completion. But a Hegel without that confidence would be a philosopher who still allows for a divergence between the ought and the is, between what should be the case and what happens to be the case. Rationality for Hegel is not only recollective, as Brandom claims, it is prospective. Determinate negation is only assured of its positive results due to the telic concept of self-reconciled spirit that guides it. It's the basic premise of Hegel's system, in other words, that normativity and objectivity converge. but they don't simply converge as a happy coincidence of provisional agreement. They converge because this endpoint is a metaphysical requirement of reason. This is why Stephen Holgate, in a vigorous review of Random's interpretation, tells us that the pragmatist reading evades the key premise of Hegel's system, namely that the task of philosophy is to understand the rationality inherent in what there is. Now, many critics have noted that Hegel's principle of rational holism seems to involve a paradox, since it seems to suggest that the world must already have gained its final coherence for us to know that any of its constituent parts are negative or one-sided. Michael Rosen, in his book, has called this the post-festum paradox. Rosen's discussion of this problem is largely persuasive, I think, though I don't have the time here to offer a full reconstruction. And for my purposes, it will suffice to say that in Hegel's system, the principle of imminent critique and the principle of rational holism are mutually supportive, like two pillars of an arch. I'll explain. Imminent critique does not mean simply defeating a doctrine with its own weapons, since the fruits of mere refutation could be indistinguishable from skepticism. Imminent critique must be what Hegel calls determinate negation, since it is defeat that yields superior knowledge. But the judgment as to whether our criticism is fruitful or merely skeptical only makes sense if we have anticipated a rational whole in which all of our criticism would come to rest. Now, as we turn to Adorno, it's a commonplace to say that his own conception of the dialectic belongs to a pessimistic phase in modern history when the idea of a rational whole had lost its credibility. Even before the publication of Negative Dialectics in 1966, Adorno had already deployed the phrase after Auschwitz as an historical metonym for an entire epoch of disbelief, an epoch in which traditional aesthetic forms such as poetry had grown intolerable, and more generally, an era of global warfare and mass death whose horrors invalidated the crypto-theodicy implicit in Hegel's idea of a reconciling world spirit. Although Adorno did not publish extensive work on Hegel until he collected Zwei Studien zur Hegel in 1963, he had already delivered lectures such as An Introduction to Dialectics in 1958 that laid the groundwork for his own rejoinder to Hegel's philosophy. More extensive challenges to Hegel followed, first in texts such as the 1964 lectures on history and freedom, and then in Negative Dialectics itself, the culminating statement that Adorno called his fat child. In what may rank as its best known passage, Adorno responds to Hegel's philosophy with a skepticism that verges on disdain. His anger is aroused chiefly by the blithe confidence that reason rules the world. The feeling which, after Auschwitz, resists every assertion of positivity of existence as sanctimonious prattle, as injustice to the victims, which is reluctant to squeeze any meaning, be it ever so washed out of their fate, has its objective moment after events that condemn the construction of a meaning of imminence, which radiates from an affirmatively positive transcendence to a mockery. The capacity for metaphysics is made lame because what occurred smashed the basis of the compatibility of speculative metaphysical thought with experience. This passage illustrates what many see as the decisive difference between Adorno and Hegel. Adorno, it would seem, rejects the principle of rational holism. Or to be more precise, he rejects the notion that the world is fully intelligible to reason in such a way as to affirm the unity of description and normativity. If the record of history is supposed to be the transcript of spirit's self-actualization, then according to Hegel, we must imagine that immanence and transcendence have now converged. But this means that we must endorse what is as what should be. Invoking the nearly unspeakable horror with an intentionally unspoken reference, was geschah, or what happened, Adorno calls into question this principle of rational holism, not least because in the name of justice, it does an injustice to history's victims. Even on a first reading of his work, this rejection of rational holism is more or less evident. We know from lectures such as the Introduction to Dialectics that Adorno wished to draw a sharp distinction between what he called the closed dialectic of Hegel and his own model of a dialectic as fractured or open. Now, that difference may seem inseparable. The Hegelian dialectic appears to Adorno as closed because the standpoint of reason is and can only be recollective. Absolute knowing is only possible once the whole has reached its completion, and spirit can then look back in satisfaction upon what it has achieved. In rejecting the closed dialectic, Adorno means to deny that the world now manifests reason's self-satisfaction or self-realization. What appears to Hegel as an accomplishment appears to Adorno as mere ideology. He concludes that the Hegelian dialectic rests on an illusory belief in spirit's capacity to create a world after its own image. But this is more than mere illusion if this speaks a will to total domination. For Hegel, spirit as subject fully actualizes itself in the objective world. Against this belief, Adorno insists on what he calls the primacy of the object. The subject wields concepts as instruments to dominate the world, but the object will always retain its stubborn materiality beyond the reach of the discursive mind. This is why the dialectic must remain forever open, and the closure of reason is, according to Adorno, an impossibility. Now, what I've stated so far would seem to suggest that the standard view is correct. Adorno rejects the principle of rational holism. But before we conclude that this point is settled, let's consider the other pillar of Hegel's dialectic, namely the principle of imminent critique. As early as his essay, Cultural Criticism in Society, Adorno endorses this principle. He argues that the alternative, transcendent critique, is impossible, since it would require a standard external to the world we examine. Such an external standard would presuppose what Adorno calls an Archimedes point outside the world we inhabit. But critical theory, he says, disavows any such Archimedes point as a metaphysical fiction. So we must reject transcendent critique and embrace imminent critique as the only plausible alternative. Adorno, in fact, insists that we see the imminent procedure as the more essentially dialectical. It takes seriously the principle that it is not ideology in itself which is untrue, but rather its pretension to correspond to reality. Imminent criticism of intellectual and artistic phenomena seeks to grasp, through the analysis of their form and meaning, the contradiction between their objective idea and that pretension. It names what the consistency or inconsistency of the work itself expresses of the structure of the existent. Now, many scholars would agree that critical theory employs the method of critique. Axel Honneth, for example, claims that critical theory begins from the premise that, this is the top quote, only those principles or ideals which have already taken some form in the present social order can serve as a valid basis for social critique of that order. This conclusion is confirmed by Titus Stahl, the author of an important 2013 study of imminent critique. And Stahl defines it as follows: in a nutshell, an imminent critique of society is a critique which derives the standards it employs from the object criticized, that is, the society in question, rather than approaching that society with independently justified standards. As Stahl notes, the practice of imminent critique, familiar to Adorno and others in the tradition of critical theory, bears an obvious resemblance to the practice as it appears earlier in the writings by Marx and then by Hegel, both of whom subscribe to the idea that our scrutiny of a given social order or model of experience must begin by taking seriously the standards that this order or model claims to uphold for itself. This is because imminent critique wants to evaluate the coherence of a given order without introducing standards that are exotic to that order. If our current order is convicted of irrationality, this is because we can reveal an internal misalignment between the order and its stated aims. The great advantage of imminent critique is it doesn't require that we import standards of judgment from elsewhere. This advantage is especially important for a critical theory of society, since a critical theory does not conceive of itself as enjoying a privileged epistemic position outside the society it describes. Denying the Cartesian split between subject and object, it claims or admits to being dialectically entangled with the social object, and it mobilizes norms that belong to its own world. Now, many would agree that Adorno understands himself as practicing a species of imminent critique, but some scholars have asked whether imminent critique alone can suffice to give Adorno the leverage he needs if he finds that our current order suffers from serious distortion. The worry is that in a gravely distorted world, all of the available standards will also suffer from distortion. Appealing to any available standards may help us to achieve an alignment between the current order and its own standards, but it will not assist us in transforming the order beyond what those standards demand. In her recent book, Critique of Forms of Life, Rachel Yegi addresses this problem by distinguishing between what she calls internal critique and imminent critique. Internal critique only rectifies the misalignment based on standards that are held steady and are currently recognized as valid. Imminent critique sees the standards themselves as in motion. It aims to transform both the standards and the order by which those standards are judged. Internal critique, she says, can have conservative or system-affirming effects. Imminent critique can alert us to the need for change and will push beyond the mere affirmation of the system as it is. Borrowing from Yegi, we need to think of Adorno's practice of imminent critique as transformative in just that sense. But this means that it must see imminent norms as in some sense pointing beyond the given order, rather than merely affirming that order or assisting in its stabilization. Unless we wish to say that Adorno is a mere conservative, he thus needs to think of imminent critique as anticipating conditions that do not yet obtain. The standards that support imminent critique must therefore be conceived as both imminent to the current order and as somehow pointing to the transcendence of that order. Axel Honneth concludes that these standards therefore have a dialectical status that he calls imminent transcendence, that you find them in the current order, if they point to the transcending of that order. Notice, however, that this idea of transcendence involves or requires a certain directionality. The anticipatory purpose of imminent critique is that it assists us in rectifying at least some conditions and points the way toward their improvement. But this means that we have to take Adorno as embracing at least some norm of what we might in everyday language call progress. Critics such as Amy Allen wish to argue that critical theory must untether itself from any idea of progress because this idea is contaminated by colonialist ideology. But if critique addresses itself to present conditions and aims toward the realization of a future that would remedy the social suffering those conditions have caused, then at least some idea of progress, however modest, would seem to be an ineliminable feature of imminent critique. And I think Adorno affirms exactly that. The temporal nature of progress, its simple concept for progressing is simply inconceivable outside time, binds it to the empirical world. Without such a temporal dimension, in other words, without the hope that things might improve with time, the heinous aspects of the world and its ways really would become immortalized in thought, and creation itself would be turned into the work of a Gnostic demon. And then a little later on in the same lectures, he says, too little that is good has power in the world for the world to be said to have achieved progress. But there can be no good not even a trace of it without progress. Such passages would seem to confirm that Adorno endorses the practice of imminent critique. He even seems to endorse its anticipatory or directional quality, since, much like Hegel, he understands imminent critique as a critical practice that fastens upon the negative with an eye toward bringing about conditions that would better realize our hope for how the world should be. At this point, however, we confront a serious philosophical problem. The negative is only conceivable as a misalignment between how the world should be and how it now is. But we can speak of a misalignment only if we postulate some future alignment as our regulative or symptotic ideal. It would seem to follow that in order to practice an imminent critique, Adorno must at least have some conception of how the world should be. And this prompts me to say that we must then revisit the question of rational holism, the other prong of Hegel's dialectic. It looks as if Adorno, not unlike Hegel, must conceive of a possible reconciliation. If he did not, he could have no assurance at all that fastening upon the negative would have the proper kind of anticipatory character. It's all the more puzzling then to find that Adorno begins the negative dialectic with what appears to be a rejection of just this premise. So this is the point in the paper where I'm very angry at Adorno because he's denying what I'm attributing to him. The formulation negative dialectics transgresses against tradition. Already in Plato, dialectics intended to establish something positive through the thought means of the negation. The figure of a negation of the negation named this precisely. This book, the book he's writing, would like to emancipate dialectics from these types of affirmative essence without relinquishing anything in terms of determinacy. The development of its paradoxical title is one of its intentions. Now, the problem with this passage, and here you're welcome to disagree with me, some of you may. The problem with this passage is that it does not accurately represent Adorno's own efforts. Throughout his work, he practices a critique that, like Hegel, locates precisely in the negative a moment of anticipation that points beyond it. In his theory of art, Adorno ascribes this anticipatory character to aesthetic experience. Art offers what Baudelaire, borrowing from Stendhal, called a promesse du bonheur. Elsewhere in his aesthetic theory, however, Adorno claims that art anticipates the more general condition that he calls a liberated, reconciled humanity. In other writings, he appeals to this normative ideal as the right life, as happiness, or simply as peace. Consider, for instance, this astonishing passage from the late study on subject and object, where Adorno appeals to peace. Peace, he writes, is the state of differentiation without domination, with the differentiated participating in each other. Now, before we move to the rash conclusion that Adorno fully endorses the Hegelian idea of reconciliation, we should look more closely at this claim. For Hegel, rational identity is not an undifferentiated identity, but a mediated identity of a differentiated whole. For Adorno, however, the normatively loaded ideal of peace does not consist in anything as strong as a mediated identity, nor is this anything like an identity gained through reason. It's a condition where the differentiated particulars do not remain in a state of mutual indifference, but somehow, he says, participate in one another. These two normative standards are notably distinct. The Hegelian dialectic aims toward a reconciliation of universal and particular within a rational whole. Adorno, however, would insist that the primacy of the object forbids any notion of discursive unity. Whatever it is that he has in mind in his frequent appeals to reconciliation, it can't entail a thoroughgoing unity through concepts, since the primacy of the concept would revert to the model of the subject's domination over the world. Instead, he prefers to invoke the metaphor of a constellation, in which the dispersed particulars retain their individual distinction, and they resist the subject's primacy. My point, in other words, is not that Adorno and Hegel are fully in agreement, but it now looks as if their disagreement is far more specific than we might have supposed. And it's far more precise than Adorno himself implies. Hegel believes that the standard of reconciliation has already been achieved, at least in its broad outlines, while Adorno believes that it remains only a promissory note on an unwritten future. But Adorno has not abandoned a normative standard that lies beyond negativity. Like Hegel, he must retain that standard in order to secure for imminent critique its anticipatory character. Otherwise, he could have no assurance that in tarrying with the negative, we are aiming toward some kind of state that he calls peace, or truth, or the right life, or sometimes the reconciled condition. Now, no doubt this conclusion may strike some of you as controversial, but Adorno, always alive to the ironies of his own arguments, seems to have recognized that his proximity to Hegel left him vulnerable to the charge that the practice of imminent critique must itself presuppose a standpoint of completion. In the finale to Minima Moralia, he insists that we can only pursue critique if we look upon the world from the vantage of its redemption. This line has tempted some readers to understand him as an irrationalist or crypto-theologian or what have you. But I want to suggest that his appeal to redemption is more plausibly understood as a concession to the Hegelian principle that criticism presupposes the ideal of a world that is finally reconciled with itself. This is a principle that does not distinguish Adorno from Hegel. It is a principle they share. Where they part company is that Adorno's holism is far more fallibilistic than Hegel could ever allow. Adorno lacks the metaphysical confidence in holism as a condition that is achieved, and he's therefore thrown back into a posture of epistemic humility that prohibits him from claiming any certain knowledge of the whole. Although he requires holism as a postulate, he admits that his criticism must leave even this very postulate in doubt. In his 1963 lectures on problems of moral philosophy, he describes this conclusion as an antinomy. Something like the right life, ein richtiges Leben, is not conceivable unless you hold fast to both conscience and responsibility. At this point, we find ourselves really and truly in an antinomical situation. We need to hold fast to the normative, to self-criticism, to the question of right and wrong, and at the same time, to a sense of the fallibility of the authority that has the confidence to undertake such self-criticism. Now, in this paper, I've tried to suggest that in comparing their respective ideas of the dialectic, we find that Adorno shares more in common with Hegel than we typically admit. The standard view has long been that Adorno, like Hegel, is committed to the principle of imminent critique. But the standard view has also held that Adorno ultimately turns against Hegel because he rejects any principle of reconciliation. Rather than longing for the Hegelian ideal of closure, where identity and non-identity come to rest, the Adornian dialectic remains open from the non-identical. The chief argument that I've tried to defend here is that the standard view involves a serious overstatement. The very practice of imminent critique does not rule out reconciliation, it presupposes it. Now, a skeptic may respond at this point that my argument has neglected a crucial difference. After all, even if Adorno wished to, as he said, hold fast to the normative and to the corresponding ideal of what he calls the right life, he never claimed to possess an incorrigible understanding of what this right life would consist in. This skeptical response is instructive, but it hardly refutes what I've argued here. Adorno does not appeal to the reconciled condition with the certitude of Hegel's absolute knowing. He appeals to it only obliquely, and with the chastened understanding that no philosophy can claim for itself the God's eye vantage of recollective reason. He admits that a damaged world does not permit us any knowledge of undamaged norms. In Minima Moralia, he makes precisely this point. The existing cannot be overstepped except by means of a universal derived from the existing order itself. The universal triumphs over the existing through the latter's own concept, and therefore in its triumph, the power of mere existence constantly threatens to reassert itself by the same violence that broke it. Much like Marx before him, Adorno insists that we possess no knowledge of an unblemished utopia. We are limited to the concepts and standards that currently obtain. Although we must hold fast to normativity to guide us in our critical practice, the norms that we have available to us are just as damaged as the world we wish to understand. This is indeed a crucial difference between Adorno and Hegel. While the Hegelian dialectic arrogates to itself the authority of recollective reason, Adorno's dialectic disavows any certain knowledge of a reconciled world. To recall the distinction from Marx's afterword to Capital, there are two ways of conceiving of the dialectic, the one affirmative, the other critical. If Hegel's concept is vulnerable to the post-festum paradox, as Rosen calls it, this is because Hegel affirms what exists as fully actualized spirit. Adorno, however, is immune to this charge because he does not claim for himself any such epistemic privilege. Now, the burden of my paper, however, has been to show that Adorno shared with Hegel far more than is generally acknowledged. Hegel had argued that because philosophy is a practice of recollective reason, we must confine ourselves to painting the world as it is. Description and criticism coincide, which means that we must restrict our palette to gray. Hegel states this point with great pathos in a famous passage from the Philosophy of Right. When philosophy paints its gray in gray, a shape of life has grown old, and it cannot be rejuvenated, but only recognized by the gray in gray of philosophy. Now, the conventional reading of Adorno would rightly emphasize that he rejects this Hegelian model of philosophy as a merely retrospective task. But that's not the end of the story. Adorno still insists that critique demands at least a minimal concept of reconciliation. And here is his immediate, this explicit rejoinder to Hegel. Consciousness could not despair at all over what is gray if it did not harbor the concept of a different color, whose scattered trace is not lacking in the negative whole. Although many readers of Adorno take him to be a thoroughgoing negativist, I've tried to suggest otherwise. The practice of imminent critique, I would argue, would be unintelligible if we could not refer to a concept of reconciliation. Since without this standard, we could not explain what it is that our current order has failed. We should admit that for Adorno, unlike Hegel, this standard remains largely counterfactual. And where it appears at all, it betrays signs of damage that belong to the conditions of its appearance. To invoke the biblical idiom, we can see the face of the Lord only as if through a glass darkly. But if we discern even the smallest trace in the current whole, then Adorno retains a greater affinity with Hegel than many have claimed. The premise of reconciliation underwrites not only an affirmative dialectic, it persists in the negative dialectic as well. Thank you.
Well, many thanks to for opening up an enormous can of real worms. Begin to somehow we fish with Let me open the floor to Peter to answer the questions that lots of my head. So we would love to get.
Peter, it seems to me that this is going to be a tremendous simplification, but that in the first place, you're saying that Adorno has a performative contradiction that he's dealing with. That is the difference between what he's explicitly saying and what he's doing. As we saw, there's a performative contradiction. But then, what is the status of the recognition of the performative contradiction? Exactly. That is it simply that? I mean, is that what negative dialectics consists in? That is the recognition of the performative contradiction as the way in which one keeps it open. One finds just traces of it everywhere, but one doesn't try to gather it somehow into a reconciliation.
Yeah.
Does that sort of get the outlines of what of the
Okay,
difference
so
here?
this is a good question. I think I want to resist the claim that there's a performative contradiction. I mean, this is an old Habermasian charge. I actually think that passage from the preface to Negative Dialectics is bad advertising. And it's actually a kind of remark that Adorno makes quite rarely in his work. Yes, he says things like he wants to endorse an open and fractured dialectic. But I would say that, on the contrary, more frequently in his work, he openly and without embarrassment alludes to some normative standards that he calls by various names, and he's terribly inconsistent in what he calls it. Sometimes he calls it the reconciled condition. Sometimes he calls it truth. Sometimes he calls it peace, as I referred to there. Sometimes, and this is where I got the title of my book, he calls it happiness, or he calls it metaphysical experience. And there are various names scattered through his writing for what he wants to call this condition. And what I want to claim is that the practice of imminent critique logically presupposes this anticipatory norm. Otherwise it could just constantly advert to skepticism. And it would just be saying, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. But the question is, why is it bad? What is it failing? What expectation do we bring to social reality that social reality has failed? Now, I think it's pretty clear that Adorno has such expectations. This is why he says we hold fast to the normative. My claim, therefore, is that the image of Adorno as a thoroughgoing negativist is actually just misleading from the start. And it's resulted in a number of philosophical puzzles that have the result of creating really interesting philosophical exercises, because then you look like you have a performative contradiction, or you have this terrible paradox, which he names in the preface to Negative Dialectics. I don't actually think it's a paradox. And I think he's doing an injustice to the anticipatory norm, which is animating his work. And most often, I think he fesses up to that anticipatory norm. I think it's actually quite rare that he makes gestures of thoroughgoing negativism that make it look like he's caught in a thoroughly skeptical trap. So that's what I want to say.
Yeah, it's also a terrible simplification, but in continuing this, when it could one say that Adorno refuses the holistic or the whole in the concept of thought, but that in the practice of thought or in the practice of reason, he is led to invoke it in these multiple forms that you just evoke, as peace, as happiness, as etc. But that there is a tension, the way you form it, it's not a paradox then, or not a performative contradiction, but it differentiates between the conceptual totalizing side of thought and the practice of reason
Yeah.
its historical instantiation.
Yeah, that's a very, very nice way of putting it. I actually like that solution, and I'm undecided as to how much that's his solution. I can't make up my mind.
And it brings reason more, it's in my background coming, brings reason more, and you use the term exercise.
Yeah,
It brings reason more into the horizon of the spiritual exercise than, which always has to, and it's not a compromise, but it always has to kind of act upon itself in introducing this element.
yeah. Yeah, I think the word practice, like exercise, is very helpful here because, and I try to get into this a little bit in my book. The way Adorno practices criticism seems to follow the logic of practical reason as Kant understands it, which is to say that we postulate certain norms, even though those norms are not instantiated in our experience. And that kind of Kantian second critique understanding of what Adorno was doing makes a lot of sense to me. So he can say, from the practical point of view, yeah, I have to presuppose this, but it's not something that I can ever witness. I don't see the reconciled condition, just like I don't see immortality and I don't see the free will. And I think that Adorno sounds a lot like that. And certainly in negative dialectics, he makes a great deal of the comparison between his own practice of criticism and Kant's second critique. And he makes a great deal of the analogy between what he's doing and the postulates of practical reason. So that's a helpful way of thinking about it. But it does leave him in a position of still being committed to alluding to these things. And then there's one further problem, which is that Adorno is not an idealist in the way that Kant is. So these things can't remain mere logical postulates. They have to have some experiential warrant for Adorno. I mean, he's still enough of a materialist to want to say this image of the reconciled condition, which is animating my critical practice, can't be purely counterfactual. It can't be just a notion that gives me the normative equipment I need when I criticize the world. It has to have some experiential warrant. In other words, I need to be able to point to something in my experience, which at least intimates what that reconciled condition would be. And that's why I like that final quote, which is a rejoinder to Hegel, where he says, its traces are not lacking in the negative whole. And that helps to explain, much of Adorno's aesthetic theory, where it's clear he does think that there are experiential traces of that sort that have a promise of happiness to them. And it explains all of the other, embodied sensual experiences as richly documented, for example, in Minima Moralia, in his writings on Beethoven, and all over the place in his work, where it's clear that there's an experiential hint of that postulated norm that's animating critical practice.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really a very stimulating talk. I have two questions. One is about reconciliation and realization, and the second one is about normativity and negative norm philosophies. The first one, you presented the things both on the introduction of negative dialectic and of realization. And I read this also as a reference to dialectic areas and Hubertus-Siskowski. So I was wondering if reconciliation for Adorno is not has not the notion of a not yet. So it points to the future actually, whereas like Hegel already claims it's already there. So I was wondering what you have to say about the left Hegelian influence in Adorno's reading of dialectics and reconciliation. But the second question about normativity, I was wondering if Adorno's idea of normativity is not more about what ought not to be. So the absence of suffering, the absence of sacrifice, and this is more a materialist, like traditional materialist idea about what is possible, like production capacities and so on. So is there a necessity that people will suffer or not?
Philippe, I'm glad you asked two easy questions. All right. So on the noch nicht, on the not yet, and the reference to left Hegelianism. I mean, I think the first step in thinking about Adorno alongside Hegel is surely to say, yeah, on some fairly conventional understanding of Hegel, the normativity is at hand. Spirit has realized itself in the world, and the left Hegelian critique is to say, not so fast. Spirit hasn't yet achieved that self-realization. There's something left to be done, and then you get that. Then you get that kind of melancholy gesture at the beginning of negative dialectics. Philosophy lives on because the moment of its realization was missed. And one can understand that as a kind of reference to left Hegelians. And I appreciate that, but I want to say something stronger, which is that I want to say something stronger and a little bit strange, which I didn't really get into in the talk, which is this category of reconciliation is not quite the same thing for Adorno as it is for Hegel. And this is, I only alluded to this very quickly in passing, but Adorno wants to conceive of peace or truth or the reconciled condition as somehow a state of dispersed particulars where each one participates in the other and they form a constellation. And this is not a reconciled whole. And here I think Martin Jay's new book on magical nominalism will help us understand this ideal, because that seems to me the ideal that Adorno wants to uphold as against some Hegelian notion of a fully rationally mediated whole. And that's a difference. And I didn't emphasize that difference. And I do think there's some daylight between those two concepts. I'm not sure ultimately what that daylight really consists in, because it's interesting that Adorno wants to say the particulars participate in one another. And that kind of sounds like mediation. And so, I mean, one would have to work out logically what the difference is between particulars that are participating in one another and a rationally mediated whole, which consists in sublated particulars that nonetheless retain their particularity within a whole. So those are two, they clearly are two different concepts, but I'm not sure how they're different. And that's, if this will turn into something larger, I'll have to figure that out. Now, in terms of your second question, you were saying that maybe Adorno's normativity consists in a claim as to what ought not to be. And here I should just say that my entire book is an attempt to overcome that negativist reading of Adorno. I mean, Fabian Freinhagen's book inspired me to write the book, and it's superb. I think it's actually one of the very best books on Adorno that's been written in a long time. But I disagree with him. And, so I think he and I imagine will have many further exchanges about this. But I think that Adorno's conception of how the world should be is not limited to the negativist claim of how the world should not be. And I think one can see that by looking at Adorno's work. He's not a thoroughgoing negativist in that sense, who merely wants to offer the counsel of living less wrongly, which is the subtitle of Fabian's book. I think Adorno has this very rich, sensuous conception of what the right life would consist in. Now, it's not a fully painted portrait, just as Marx's conception of communism is not a fully painted portrait. But I dare to say that no one would say that Marx is only interested in getting us to live less wrongly. And Marx has grandiose ambitions about what he calls the riddle of history solved. And that's something far more than a negativist interpretation. And similarly, I think we find far more than that in Adorno. Yes.
Thanks so much. Actually, I was now you've piqued my question here because of this last claim you made about a rich notion for Adorno how life should be. I was going to ask more maybe in the line with Kathy about a performative aspect of Adorno instead, contra what you just said about the fullness, as sort of operating or positioning his own work as a placeholder in a certain way. It's not a position, but it's also not just the negativism of not that, not that, not that. So that Adorno would be enacting a place that is, as you described it, this epistemic humility that is not negativist. So it's sort of holding that place, or anticipatory norm without a definitive normativity, or a materialism but utterly without metaphysics. You know, that so that it can't be like Hegel, where there be metaphysics. That maybe with Horkheimer, for me, the notion that of setting up a sort of holding open a place, that placeholder as, you know, the disaster of enlightenment closes in or seems to be foreclosing more and more and more, that there would be just somehow much less than what you're talking about with the fullness of this vision, but holding open a place for the other possibility that is not negativist and not just messianic and not just, you know, Hegelian metaphysical. Does this make sense in terms of what I'm saying, a placeholder? So it's not just negative, but it's also not anything else yet.
Yeah. Maybe so. That's helpful. I think that, you know, Adorno uses some interesting words when he talks about this placeholder, and he fills it in maybe a little bit more than you're suggesting, and maybe less than I'm suggesting. But you know, one of the words he uses quite frequently when he's speaking about this animating postulate is happiness, which is what I use in my book, and he speaks about it quite frequently. He doesn't fix upon it as the only term. He uses it kind of interchangeably, even with words like utopia, even though he disavows utopia when he's speaking to Bloch and wants to distance himself from Bloch. I mean, Adorno's a frustratingly antagonistic thinker in the sense that he will push against whoever his interlocutor is and insist that his view and his commitments are not the ones of his interlocutor. And then when he leaves that interlocutor aside and goes elsewhere, he'll suddenly invoke the norm that the interlocutor seems to uphold. So, you know, the conversation with Ernst Bloch over the not yet and utopia is an example of that. So I want to say it's something stronger than a placeholder. It looks like Adorno thinks that there's a notion of sensuous fulfillment. He speaks very frequently about the image of happiness that is portrayed, for example, by Shakespeare in Romeo and Juliet. He thinks that image of sensuous fulfillment is a model for us, but only one model among others of the kind of right life that we need to hold fast to when we engage in criticism. And the final thing I want to say is that your idea of a placeholder is helpful if, as long as we hold the notion of placeholder to be one that is placed very, very high. And to me, this is what's really crucial and what I think is often misunderstood about Adorno. I'm not accusing you of a misunderstanding, but in a lot of the secondary literature on Adorno, they make it sound as if he just that he's just a melancholic who finds all conditions of current life unacceptable. But what I want to say is, if that criticism seems so vigorous, it's only because his normative standards are in fact so high. In other words, it's because he holds such exacting standards for what the right life would be that he seems to be constantly disappointed and so vigorous in his criticism of everything around him. And that seems to me just entirely obvious. I mean, his critique of the culture industry makes that completely clear, it seems to me. He just finds most of it garbage, as he says. I mean, that's not a paraphrase, that's the word. It's garbage. But why? Well, because it doesn't live up to an almost impossibly high expectation that he has for what aesthetic criteria should be. And those criteria are not just aesthetic, as he says, you know, art is a promissory note on the right life. So placeholder is an interesting idea, but I want to insist that the place has to be something that's very exacting and places extraordinary demands on us in our criticism. I don't know whether hand the first. Oh, yeah.
Hey, Peter.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your talk. Very great to hear you and great to think through a more affirmative reading of Adorno. I was wondering, I'd be interested in hearing a little more about your understanding of thoroughgoing skepticism, thoroughgoing negativity, thoroughgoing normative skepticism, and all of these thoroughgoings. Because the way I understand the paragraph that's taken from the terminology is that thoroughgoing skepticism, as Hegel puts it, consists in not to give oneself over to the thought of others of a mere authority, but to examine everything for oneself and follow only one's own conviction, or better yet, to produce everything oneself, etc. This road in the phenomenology is the road of the education of consciousness to science. Now, I think I was wondering if you could not reconcile your reading of Adorno with this concept of thoroughgoing skepticism instead of refuting it. And what I mean by this is that I think you could actually double down on thoroughgoing negativism in order to make exactly your point that going through all the negativity, going through the contradictions, there's always this glimmer of hope in the cracks of the world.
Okay, thank you. So I'll try to say something brief because I know the answers are not long. I want to insist that there's a difference between thoroughgoing skepticism and the practice of imminent critique. Because thoroughgoing skepticism can defeat a particular claim and leave you exactly where you were. But it looks like Adorno, it looks like the Hegelian dialectic has this very important proviso built into it, which is that your critique of say a claim or a model or an institution defeats that model or claim or institution with a productive result that moves you on to something further and better, and doesn't leave you just in the position that you were before, where you once again don't know what the right way to go is. And this is what I took from Michael Rosen's argument, which I think it's a superb point when he refers to Hegel's post-festum paradox, which is that for Hegel to get imminent critique going, the norms that are the objects of our skeptical pressure have to be defeated with an anticipatory result. That is, you don't just defeat them and end up where you were before. You defeat them and learn something through refutation. And you don't just learn something in the kind of old Socratic method of the dialectic where you defeat them and you're left in euphoria and you don't know anything more. You defeat them and move to something higher. The defeat has a kind of directionality to it. And Rosen's point about the post-festum paradox is that the entire structure of dialectical reasoning points toward the satisfaction of all of our critical work, where that critical work can finally come to rest. Now, that's not something that simply posing skeptical challenges could do. So this is the difference.
Thank you.
Yes. Mark.
A couple of comments. First, on the Freinhagen negative model. Although I think you're right, this is pervasive. It isn't, I think, completely a consensus model, because there is, after all, in the Frankfurt School of History and Robert Adorno in particular, a utopian strain that, despite the critique of Bloch's version of it, was never given up. So there's always some sort of odd mixture of I don't know what, despair about what is the case, Lust or Shah, and also something utopian that allows those cracks still to be, So I think there's a little bit of a straw man in the kind of attack on negativism as if that were absolute prevailing. The more interesting point has to do with something you, I think, put on the board from Hegel, where he talks about the extraordinary labor of world history. Now, this is a concept that I think in virtually every respect, Adorno would have attacked. In other words, the idea of the labor of something would have been, as I think Habermas made clear, too much beholden to the productivist model of how human beings operate. The labor of the concept or the labor of human beings in a material sense. Adorno did not buy that as a key way to understand human condition. He doesn't spend a lot of time drawing on the economic and philosophical manuscripts, the early Marx, for that reason. And then secondly, the idea of world history, which is a notion of a singular meta subject, is something that not only Auschwitz dissuades him from, but also a kind of sense that this is a myth, that the idea of a meta subject totalizing the world is a myth. So he's already backing away from those models. Now, where does this leave him in terms of providing any sort of real substance to the hope? What we call it happiness, peace, whatever. In other words, how do we get there? World history isn't labor. The working class isn't labor. There isn't a meta subject. Now, Habermas draws from this a kind of sense of the bankruptcy of consciousness philosophy in general. You can't have a subject, meta, individual, whatever, that is going to do it. It has to be more plural, more subjective, more differentiated. It has to avoid the kind of overly totalizing notion of us. And in the rhetoric that I think you've taken from him, there's an awful lot of what we should be doing, what we should be thinking, what Adorno tells us to do. When you might argue that it's precisely the problem to assume there is a we or an us, that is even to tell us. Let's say it might be better to think of you or they or a plurality which doesn't come together into a meta collective subject, a subject that is even compatible with difference. That it may be a subject that never quite, the idea of a subject is probably like coheres. And that leads to a kind of practical question, which is who is going to bring this about? How is it going to happen? What are the politics? Which has always been an issue, the so-called political deficit of the Frankfurt School and Adorno in particular. So there is, I think, a real, I would say, crucial distinction between the Hegelian position, the Hegelian Marx position, and the Adorno position on precisely this issue. He could never have said the extraordinary labor of world history.
Thank you. Okay, that's really helpful. And I grant that that's an important difference. However, when we think of Adorno's practical work as a public intellectual in the last 20 years of his life, he had rather practical objectives in view as to what needed to be done by the German polity writ large, which is to say a kind of we that he associated himself with, which is to say he didn't adopt a kind of, easygoing pluralism. He had some idea that there's a German polity at stake, that it has certain pathologies, and that it actually needs to rectify certain deficiencies. And although he doesn't speak of labor, he does speak of education, which is another one of Hegel's central terms. When Hegel thinks about the world spirit undergoes ill-going, undergoes education, undergoes a learning process. And for Adorno, this is crucial, of course, to what he thinks a non-pathological democracy looks like. It involves education for maturity. And, one of the things I tried to bring out in my book is the kind of Kantian resonance that's at work in these kinds of things. And definitely the Kantian resonance that's at work in that notion of a collective process of education for maturity, where he does explicitly invoke Kant. I think you're right that the notion of work is something that he sort of wants to give up. And I guess it was in an interview with you that he said, Marx wanted to turn the entire world into a vast workhouse. And so he turns against that whole productivist paradigm that he thinks comes out of Marxism. And what he wants instead seems to have much more to do with, the Marxist ideal of the emancipation of the senses, for example, without maybe the difficult matter of distributive justice and who's going to do what job. So I mean, I agree with you about the point about work, but I think the point about education is a moment where there's a convergence with a Hegelian idea that humanity really is involved in a kind of collective process here of learning the right way to live. This is why resignation, the very last pieces he wrote, that I think, if I recall correctly, it actually read on the radio only after his death. Maybe I'm mistaken about this. You'll remember. But the piece Resignation ends with his making a kind of universalist gesture, where he says the thinking that that appears in the eye of, the happiness that appears in the eye of the thinking person is the happiness of humanity. Which is to say, there's some notion there of a universal collective subject, and there's still a notion there guiding of what that collective subject could realize. You look unconvinced. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'm just curious about your, and not just you, but everyone thinks when he talks about Hegel and the negative and dialectic, that this is something negative. Yeah. Isn't it a sort of normatively neutral term, Hegel, the negative negation? I mean, he has that logical connotation, yes, and you wouldn't say that the negation of a proposition makes it a wrong proposition or a morally bad or a critical proposition. Yes, it's just a negative.
Yeah.
And Hegel is, as you know, quite often prepared to say, well, okay, what is the positive? It is the negation of the negation. So there is that sort of reciprocity, which is not easy to interpret in such a way that it ends up that the negative is that what has to be criticized, that it's normatively wrong or so.
Yeah. No, I entirely
I
agree.
think in critical theory, especially in the Hegel tradition, they just don't get it. That critique and negation are not identical. Yeah. So to say, well, I approach something critical, yeah, means that I approach it if I try to negate it in a dialectical sense. Because there you have too close together negation and critique. But I mean, it's a question of,
No, it's an interesting point. I do think that there's an important difference between negativity and negativism, you might call it.
yeah,
And certainly the dialectic works by tarrying with the negative in the sense of negativity,
exactly.
which is through determinate negation, that is the negation of the negation, you have a productive effect. I think that's entirely different from what you might call negativism, where you're saying that the work of critique is only to expose various kinds of social pathologies, and so I certainly agree there's that difference, and I have no quarrel with the general gesture of the dialectic as tearing with the negative in the sense of negativity. And there's this particular interpretive stance where Adorno is seen as someone who is willing to dwell in the position of normative negativism. And that's the thoroughgoing negativism that I was describing. There was one more hand in the back. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This builds a bit from Karen's question of the sort of like placeholder at work here. I guess I was wondering as you were speaking whether Kant in the third critique doesn't provide one example of that sort of model in the model of aesthetic judgment as proposiveness about a purpose. There seems to be a sort of normativity without a norm happening here for Adorno. And it seems to sort of point to a clear distinction between, on the one hand, a claim that we couldn't possibly know or arrive at a rational norm, and on the other hand, this weaker claim that we just don't yet know those rules. You know, and the claim about the resistance of the object in Adorno makes me imagine he takes the former path, whereas Hegel is taking the latter path. Of course, you know, this question of the norm is one of the crucial points at which Hegel breaks with Kant. And so I just wonder whether your suggestion, whether you take the proximity of Adorno to Hegel to be any closer than the proximity of Kant to Hegel, and if not, whether that isn't from a Hegelian perspective still a very large difference.
That's a great question, a very big question. I don't think maybe I'm just tired, but I want to think about it. You have my email, so we can talk about it. I'll give you a very, very short answer, which is that I take seriously Adorno's claims that his critical practice looks like Kant's practical reading. So it's more second critique than third critique, but I really like the idea that Adorno could be practicing a kind of reflective judgment, that it would be more a kind of third critique model where there wouldn't have to be, you know, say a concept of the beautiful in order to have some exacting standards that you bring to bear on art. I mean, that's very, very interesting. The very simple point I would make is that it looks like Adorno is enough of a materialist that he wants us to have instances of sensual experience that we can point to, that we all have in our lives, unless we have wholly succumbed to the withering experience. We have at least some instances of sensual material experience that we can point to that serve as warrants for upholding this postulate. And that looks like more than just reflective judgment. Because it looks like he thinks there needs to be something I can point to. There needs to be something that fills in the concept. Maybe not though. I mean, it's a very interesting suggestion. I mean, I didn't go that way. Partly because it looks like Adorno spends so much time on the second critique when he's thinking positively about his own critical practice in negative dialectics, but maybe you're right that that would be a more instructive comparison.